This is Keep Up. I'm your host, Cynthia Dill. It's Sunday, May 24th, 2026. I'm in my Cape Elizabeth studio, Memorial Day Eve. I've been wearing white. I'm sure you have too, although perhaps a white down jacket. It's quite chilly here. But spring has sprung, and of course, we're heading into the primary, which is very exciting. And other politics relates to the sports referendum, Protect Girls Sports referendum in Maine, that I just wanted to kind of loop into a conversation that I think we need to have about how billionaires have funded the trans ideology movement. There's a lot of talk about how allegedly a billionaire gave a big contribution to the Protect Girls Sports referendum group, the Maine Girl Dads. And I think that's true. I think a guy out west, gave like less than $1 million to help the signature gathering effort, which turned out to not actually be any help at all because the so-called professionals that were hired uh, didn't know the rules, and now the referendum is in jeopardy. It might not appear on the ballot, but the only reason why it's been challenged is because there's a well-funded opposition. Like, not only is there lobbyists who are staging dog and pony shows about how horrible this referendum would be and how it's funded by billionaires from out of state. But there's also been a lawsuit that was brought by, just aw shucks, kicking the tires, regular old mom and dads who, you know, no, the lawsuit that challenged the signatures was definitely also funded um, by lobbyists. And the irony is that so the argument against the referendum to protect girls' sports, the referendum that would make a law in Maine that simply states that to participate in athletics in public schools, teams are divided by biological sex, and that boys can't play on the girls' teams, basically. Like, if you're a boy who identifies as a girl, you're still welcome to play on the boys' team, right? And the boys should welcome you, right? And not discriminate. Or you could play on co-ed, but separated on the basis of biological sex and also private spaces like bathrooms and locker rooms. Okay, that's an issue that the public should weigh in on, and the signatures were gathered, but now they're being challenged, and the campaign against it is that it's supposedly by billionaires, and that it just it it's really the height of irony because this whole transgender ideology that we've like been hit with since about 2019. The speeding locomotive that came down the track and just took everybody by surprise. And suddenly, like, we look around and we don't have any laws that separate like men from women. Well, it's all been funded by billionaires, and it's just a different style. The Democrats and the progressives use the tax um, system in a little bit of a different way, but it's the same old game. So let's just say a billionaire like Stryker, this guy, right, who comes from family wealth, and he starts the what is it, the Arcus Foundation. Let's just say hypothetically that he decides he's going to fund a lot of grants for for education about gender ideology because that's what he wants to do in the world. That's how he wants to leave his mark, is to spread gender ideology, and gender ideology being that the false belief that there's no real that biological sex is irrelevant and that sex can change. And it's largely an effort by men to just invade women's spaces and to have control over women's bodies and to just control the world because that's what generally men like this guy do. And you see it, like, look at Elon Musk. People think he's crazy. He's a conservative who whatever, a lot of these guys who are parenting, fathering a lot of kids and wanting to maybe send their um you know I don't know, family, children out into Mars just to perpetuate their own sense of self. I mean, that's how big some of these personalities are. So, in the case of the transgender ideology, you've got a situation where 0.5% of adults identify as transgender, 0.5% of adults in the United States. But you can set up these grants, right? A couple of billionaires who want to push this gender ideology can make a fund, a big fund available in grants for education about gender ideology. So that then prompts the nonprofits like GLAD Law and the ACLU and Equality Maine and the Maine Women's Lobby and the Maine People's Alliance and all the other alphabet groups that are on the left. They then have an incentive to set up an education foundation, a 501c3 organization that can not only like apply for these grants, but then accept contributions, all of which are tax deductions. And then they can, just do their work, their political work on behalf of these billionaires who remain anonymous. So just looking, at GLAD Law for a second, GLAD Law, the the GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders Inc. Okay, I'm looking at their 2024 Form 990. Now, I should state that I'm a lawyer. But I'm not speaking in my capacity as a lawyer. I mean, I recognize that this might not be admissible evidence. Like I got this form off the internet and I haven't authenticated it. It's not a certified copy. There's no witness with personal knowledge who's, going to testify to its contents, but it looks it looks pretty legitimate and I did get it off of the um what is it, ProPublica site. And so they're assuming that it is the accurate form 990 of the GLAD Law Advocates and Defenders. They're a 501c3 organization. Okay, so that means anyone who contributes to that organization gets a tax deduction. They can take a tax deduction for their contribution and they can remain anonymous. So GLAD Law reports in 2024 that they had like $10 million in revenue. So that's contributions and grants. And, they spent $5 million of it on salary. And, you know, this is the work that they described as the major work on their tax return. Okay. I'm going to list six things, the six biggest things that they said that they did. Uh, First thing, they challenged a New Hampshire classroom censorship law in a case that had to do with trans. The second thing was they defended, through an amicus brief, school policies supporting transgender students in a case at the Supreme Court. The third thing was they secured a federal court ruling preliminarily blocking a law banning transgender girls, boys, from participating in school sports. That's the third thing. The fourth thing, litigation advancing transgender healthcare rights in Colorado. The fifth thing, challenging a private employer's refusal to cover an employee's medical care related to gender transition. And the sixth and final thing, filing an amicus brief with the Supreme Court in the Scrimetti case. So those are the six top things that this organization did with its $10 million that it raised in tax deductible contributions by anonymous donors. And the top paid employees, just so happen to be our very own Mary Bonato, who argued successfully the Obergefell case. She's listed as making about $223,000. So that puts her in the top 5% of income earners in the United States. The executive director of GLAD Law makes about $250,000, which puts him in like the top 3%. But then what's interesting to me is they have one other, the chief financial officer, then the fourth listed highest paid employee at this organization that raised $10 million that did all that stuff for transgender rights. Their fourth highest is Jennifer Levi, Senior Director of Transgender and Queer Rights. And Jennifer gets paid $198,000. So, I mean, GLBTQ legal advocates. No, not really. Just T advocates. The only advocacy that they're doing is for transgender rights, right? 0.5 of the population. Like there's more gay people, there's more lesbian people, there's more bisexual people than there are trans people. I mean, trans is like the same percentage as all the other. Very, very small percentage. So that's how, so the cycle is really no different than on the right? People criticize billionaires funding all these conservative political platforms, but we have the same thing. We have the same thing on the left, and the thing, in Maine that really that so let's go back to 2019. 2019 is when gender identity was added to the Maine Human Rights Act, and I've talked about this in a few other podcasts, but people have raised questions on Facebook and in the comments about, well, isn't hasn't gender identity been in the Maine Human Rights Act since 2005? Because that's what the advocates for gender ideology always say, which is really a misrepresentation, because gender identity was in the Maine Human Rights Act in 2005, but it was a subset of the definition of sexual orientation. It itself did not have a definition. So the Maine Human Rights Act had a definition of sexual orientation, and it included in the definition of sexual orientation, sexual orientation means a person's actual or perceived heterosexuality, bisexuality, homosexuality, or gender identity or expression. That's how it was beginning in 2005 up until 2019. And as far as I know, there was no cases of discrimination based on gender identity. But then in 2019, suddenly we have the executive director of Equality Maine happens to be the majority leader of the Democratic Party, and the Maine Human Rights Commission sponsors its commission bill that adds this new definition of gender identity, which for the first time says gender identity is, it's such a silly definition, I think, but gender identity means the gender-related identity, appearance, mannerisms, blah, 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 of an individual, regardless of the individual's assigned sex at birth. So that was the big clincher. That was the thing that tipped the scales for women and girls. That was the tip of the iceberg of this gender ideology storm that, whatever analogy you want to use, a speeding train, a tornado. It was just, we were just hit with this shock of gender identity, but it was just like snuck in this underhanded way. And this group, Equality Maine, they show up at the hearing. So, I'm the analogy here is people on the left were so outraged and scared and shocked and angry that the Republicans had this Project 2025 going into the Trump administration. And of course, Trump denied that he was going to follow that playbook, and he did. Okay, no surprise there. But the playbook itself, it was created by the Heritage Foundation and these 100 or so other conservative organizations, and it laid out plans exactly what they were going to do to sort of take over and reshape the United States government. And it involved, first, certainly changing policies, definitely, cleaning house and getting new people in there, from top to bottom. And this is what the left did with gender ideology. The Equality Maine came in with a bill. The majority, leader is the executive director. They not only testify that, this is a clarification of the Human Rights Act, but also, by the way, we need you to, and just listed, gender identity also needs to be, this is the list of places where this change should also be applied to create consistency in the law. And then they go on to list 13 sections in Maine law that they were just going to insert this new definition of gender identity that includes this phrase, regardless of sex assigned at birth. So it essentially erases women's existence altogether. Like there's no way to make the case that you're a woman based on your actual womanhood, because if somebody says they're a woman, if they have a gender identity as female, they're counted as a woman. So they can just come in the women's room and play on the women's team and, do all the things that women are supposed to, and do extra things. Like they get extra health care that the public pays for. I mean, it's just it was a huge change in the law, and it was the left's Project 2025 that came in through these, you know, nonprofit organizations, these so-called, public charities that people get a tax break for giving a contribution to an organization that's doing the political work of an anonymous donor with a total political agenda. And for what? For 0.5% of the population. Okay, so don't talk to me about billionaires trying to come in here and take away trans rights because that is complete BS. And, you know, um, when you have an out of state, nonprofit corporation, $10 million dollars in contributions and grants, all of which are deductible by anonymous donors, and all of their work is focused on transgender rights. I mean, what's going on there? Is that because maybe there's no other issues that face the gay and lesbian and bisexual community? Because, there is actual like equality. We came so far, and this is the remaining campaign that they're all going to hang their hats on and make money off of and have jobs. It's so that's the first just section of the show is billionaires and gender ideology. Well, the two go hand in hand. And I think I talked about what changed from 2005 to 2019. And so what the other thing that people have commented on is that they think if if they agree with me that gender identity laws should be repealed to protect the rights and safety and privacy and dignity of women and girls, that somehow they're betraying their trans friends, that somehow, that a woman who I have a lot of respect for said, "Oh, I just think, trans people should just be able to live their lives and you should stop harping on trying to take away their rights." And I am not trying to take away anyone's rights. What happened in 2019 when gender identity was added as a protected status with this new definition that says regardless of sex is that girls and women lost their rights. And that transgender people still had protection under the law, but the difference was this. Uh, we had the case here, the Nicole Maines case, and people also point to that and say, "Oh, the law court said that the Maine Human Rights Act requires public accommodations of any transgender person on the basis of sex," and that's just not true. What the law court said in 2014 in that case, there was a child who had had a gender dysphoria diagnosis for years, and the case itself was an accommodation case, what would be a reasonable accommodation. And the reasonable accommodation in this instance was providing this child her bathroom preference based on her gender dysphoria diagnosis. What the court said specifically was, though, that this is not a situation that invites anyone to just, have a gender identity and have access to restrooms. This is I'm looking at this case. This is the main case, John Doe versus Regional School Unit 26. It's sort of referred to as the Nicole Maines case. It's the 2014 law court decision. And what they say, the law court says, um, when they vacated the judgment below, they said, in vacating this judgment, we emphasize that in this case, the school had a program carefully developed over several years and supported by an educational plan designed to sensitively address Susan's, that's not the real name of the child in this case, designed to sensitively address Susan's gender identity issues. The determination that discrimination is demonstrated in this case rests heavily on Susan's gender identity and gender dysphoria diagnosis, both of which were acknowledged and accepted by the school. Thus, we do not suggest, this is the law court saying, we do not suggest that any person could demand access to any school facility or program based solely on a self-declaration of gender identity or confusion without the plans developed in cooperation with the school and the accepted and respected diagnosis that are present in this case. So that's the big difference, is that the way it used to be is if you had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, if you were a transgender person because you had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, then you could make the claim for an accommodation, and there'd be a balancing of the needs of yourself and others, whether your accommodation was reasonable or unreasonable, but there would be a balance of rights and competing claims. And that's not the case. After this law court case in 2019, we added gender identity with this new definition, and that totally changes the landscape. It's so you don't need a diagnosis. Anybody can. Just what the law court said should not be the case is now the case. That any person can demand access, based solely on a self-declaration of gender identity. So that was the big change that happened in 2019. It was a carefully constructed political plan funded by dark money from out of state, really to just push an ideology. And it doesn't, it's not really grounded in any grassroots movement whatsoever. There wasn't a single person with a personal anecdote of being discriminated against on the basis of gender identity when this massive change to the Human Rights Act was passed. There's never really a personal story of people who have been discriminated against on the basis of gender identity. We're just fed this baloney that there's higher incidence of suicide. There's not. Uh, that it's billionaires who are trying to take away trans rights. No, no, no. It's the billionaires who are trying to, make gender ideology a reality in American law, despite the fact that it discriminates against women, harms kids, and it's just it's really wreaking havoc. And so I think we're going to get to the bottom of this, and I think what we're going to see is that the American people are not going to put up with gender identity, because it strikes at the heart of who we are as people. If we can't speak the truth, if we're going to be punished for saying that a man is a man, then we're not free. We're not a free society. If women don't have the right to express their, you know, lack of consent, like we do not consent to having men in our spaces, regardless of their very strong feelings. And it's simply not based in science that there's been any change in a man because subjectively he has a gender identity as a female. Like, he's still a man. He still has XY chromosomes. He still produces sperm. He still has all the attributes of a man because he is a man. And there's nothing that's going to change that. Okay. Yes, of course, gender is a social construct. It's on a spectrum. Everybody should be able to express their gender in any way they want. Gender is non-binary. I buy all that. But when it comes to sex, there's two sexes, and women need to be protected on the basis of sex. And this movement, okay, this campaign that has been largely funded with dark money, pouring into nonprofits, it's disgusting. Okay, that these so-called nonprofit charitable organizations are handing out tax breaks, doing the bidding of these, anonymous donors with a political agenda, like, like the guy who started the Arcus Foundation. I mean, look it up. He's got a gazillion dollars. He's a billionaire, and he's got a political agenda, and this is how he decides he's going to fund it. And it's no different than any of any of these other finance bros who have these projects. Look at the IPO coming up for Elon Musk's SpaceX. I mean, these guys have a dream. They're gonna build a colony on Mars, right? And they're also in this case, they're going to change all the laws so that men can just be wherever they want. There's no division between men and women. And society is going to just accept this ideology that sex can change when it can't. So, billionaires are billionaires, and men aren't women. And that's it. Happy Memorial Day. And until next time, this is Cynthia Dill. Take care.